It's just connecting now.
Oh,
Showing your age, Case.
Yeah, very much. And look, probably much like Hayley, I started in the days when they had one computer in an office and you didn't have a mobile phone. And of course, over that time, we've seen change over the property management industry that we've adapted to. COVID, the new Omnibus Bill, is probably one of the biggest change in 20 years that I know I've come across. It's definitely turned what we do on a daily basis upside down. It's got a whole heap of new rules. I am a bit of a stickler for the rules, and I'm very, very big stickler for knowledge. So I was hoping that putting on a webinar for all the landlords, all the tenants, all the other property managers out there, to give them some information about how their tenancy is affected, what needs to be happening from here. And I'm very happy to be joined by Hayley. Hayley is one of probably the best trainers. She trains us as directors. That's how wonderful Hayley is with her job. She's always there for an ear if anyone needs her. And on top of that, she's also a director of a couple of companies. She by far has been the best trainer that I've ever been to. So I was hoping that she will be able to work with me and our community to be able to make sure that, you know, as a landlord, you guys know what's going on. As tenants, you know what's going on. And as property managers, you are working towards, you know, making sure that your clients are in the same basket as what we can put on today. Hayley.
My turn. Thank you. As Casey said, I am a trainer. I am also a director of a couple of real estate agencies. So although I know the legislation side of things from being a trainer, I actually do the job every day as well, which makes it a lot easier, I guess, for me to interpret and keep on top of all of the changes. For example, I jumped online yesterday, I did some research, and there was so much new information that was online. I'm like, wow, when did this all come out? Then I jumped onto VCAT today to make an application, and they've changed VCAT online and they've put all the information in there as well. So it's incredible how much information is coming through now and how it's changing. If you guys want to ask any questions throughout the session, you can either pop it in the chat area, or you can put it in the Q&A section, so completely up to you. But we want to make it as interactive as possible and answer any questions that you might have. If you ask a tricky question, we may have to research it and get back to you because, as I said, it's such an ever-changing environment. There's so many different areas and we're not going to probably know 100% of the answers today, but we will definitely work them out and tell you what they are later. So let's kick off. So what has basically helped? First of all, disclaimer, the situation that we're in is currently changing so rapidly, and we just want to make sure that you guys, this is a general nature of information. So we recommend that if you are going to follow any of this, that you just get legal advice as well. But it's correct up until the time that we actually present it. But who knows, tomorrow could be completely out of date. But what we're working with at the moment, so first of all, our legislation was created in 1997. We were due for a full change of legislation from the 1st of July 2020. However, with the COVID, what they've actually done is they've extended the implementation of that legislation till no later than the 1st of January 2021. So what we're currently working under is 1997 legislation with some new COVID legislation thrown in. And when all this legislation finishes, we'll then move on to a totally different legislation. So right now, Casey and I and all the other property managers have 3 lots of legislation that we're dealing with. So it's been really, really interesting times. And I have to say, property managers, we have drunk a bit of wine lately just to keep sane, or I have. So basically the Emergency Measures Act, or the COVID Act, was passed in Parliament on the 23rd of April 2020. It's now in force. It was backdated to the 29th of March. It will be automatically repealed in 6 months from this date. So towards the end of September, the current act that we're going to talk about today will be automatically repealed. The regulations that accompany the RTA have now been supplied for use. So the problem we had in the beginning was we got the legislation, but we didn't get the regulations. So we didn't know how to work with the legislation we were given for about 3 weeks. So it provided this like really grey area where we were chasing our tail, because a tenant would ask us for something, would go to CAV and they'd say, no, actually you can't do it that way. But we're like, the legislation says we can. Now we have everything supplied to us, so we can actually sit there and go, okay, we can work out what has to happen. So the new laws do create a moratorium on evictions, and that's a massive issue for a lot of people. It does facilitate rent relief for eligible tenants, suspension of rent increases, establishes a new dispute resolution processes, and the laws also make changes to how a tenant or landlord may end a tenancy during this 6-month moratorium period. So VCAT, where it's up to now, oh, it's a bit of a mess, to be honest with everyone. VCAT is still hearing certain cases, but generally critical matters and only by phone. Other matters deemed non-critical have been postponed to a future date. They haven't given us a date or told us how long it will be. They've just said it's non-critical, it's on hold for now. And at present, we don't have any timeframes for that. They're working hard to clear or hear more cases by phone and to expand their current range of services. Once an application has been made to VCAT or the tribunal, they'll contact your property manager and let them know a scheduled time for the hearing. The time of the hearing, VCAT will just call everyone by phone, and that's how the hearing takes place. It's actually quite good in that respect, because generally we drive to VCAT, we sit there. I used to do VCAT hearings in Melbourne, and it was like $75 just for car parking for us to park our car for 2 hours while we waited for a hearing, a good old days case.
Yep.
And it was just
up to about 150 by the time you'd sat there for 4 hours and waited for your case to go forward.
I know. So it was just a nightmare. So, you know, at least by phone, we're sitting at our desk, we just answer the phone and we can do it. You can still apply about any matter that, what was that?
I should probably point out too, because a lot of our communities landlords, it's actually making it a little bit quicker as well, because usually COLAC only sits once every 3 weeks, which can if you've got a you know, a tenant that was in arrears or a tenant that was due to move out and they hadn't moved out yet, you'd still be waiting another 3 weeks before a hearing. The telephone hearings are actually making it a lot quicker, so you don't have to wait that 3 weeks. It's actually worked out a little bit better for our community down here, not having to wait that long.
Yeah, I have heard that in country areas, that it's really improved the wait time, which is, I'm hoping they'll actually stick with doing some telephone hearings once all of this is over, because it makes sense. There's no reason why we can't do it. So we can still apply for any other matter that falls in VCAT's jurisdiction, but some cases won't be heard. So, for example, pet applications, that's a new one that's come in, where if a tenant, you want to say no to a tenant having a pet, you've got to go to VCAT to say no. I'm sure we'll go through this in another session, but I know of about 10 property managers that applied to say no to pets early in March, and they're still waiting for hearings. So that's the sort of thing that's non-critical. The critical ones are being heard quicker. This is how VCAT Online looks for us. So when we log on to this system at VCAT Online, this is how we actually do our notices and our applications. So this used to have another 20 notices that we could serve on a tenant. They've all been removed. They no longer exist. And they're notices of rent increase, they're notices of notice to vacates, a whole lot of different areas, and they've just disappeared. They've removed them, and they've provided us with different ways where we can actually terminate tenancies. And
that's because Hayley, that there's no longer, a landlord can no longer send notice to vacate to a tenant for any reason whatsoever. So this is why we now need to have this process in place with the new legislation for COVID.
Yeah. So what VCAT's done, or what a lot of property managers have done, if they haven't kind of understood the process, is they've just got an old paper form, a notice to vacate, for example, filled it out by hand and served it on a tenant, thinking, oh, well, I can't do it on the hub, but I've got a bit of paper, I can do that. It's void. You can't do it. They don't exist. They're gone. So there's no way around it. The only way now to actually do an application to VCAT to get a tenant out is under the application section now for a termination order. But in order to do a termination order, you actually have to lodge the request with Consumer Affairs Victoria first. And what Consumer Affairs Victoria will do, they'll give us a reference number. That reference number has to go into the hub, and then they will allow you to then go forward with the termination order. And when you're lodging that with Consumer Affairs Victoria, they're trying to sort the issue out without making you go through VCAT. So that's the process now, completely different than what we used to do. We used to just do a notice and then do an application. Now we have to actually lodge it with Consumer Affairs, try and resolve, then do a termination order. So yeah, very, very different process. And particularly for old school people like Casey and I've been in real estate 21 years. You beat me by a year. It's been a long time, and you get so used to doing it a certain way. And all of a sudden you can't do it that way. It's a bit scary. So I want to talk about rent relief, because this is a massive part of COVID. And part of what the government's brought in with this is they don't want anyone to get through this process and then have a massive debt hanging over them. So what they're trying to encourage is that tenants and landlords actually sit down and talk about things. Now, it doesn't mean you as a landlord has to sit with your tenant and chat. It means that the tenant and the property manager can talk, with the landlord obviously having their say as well. So what's going to happen is new laws have passed to protect tenants from eviction and allows tenants to negotiate a rent reduction with their landlord if they're suffering financial hardship due to COVID. So I've got a rent roll, I've got about 250 properties under management. And when this first came into place, we had quite a few tenants call up and go, we're suffering hardship due to COVID, you need to help us. And we just said, pop it on hold for a little while. We just need to get clarification from the government about how this is all going to work. Once we've got some clarification, we'll come back to you, pay the rent that you can now. Let's try and keep on top of it. And as soon as we have that legislation, we'll be able to negotiate for you. So as soon as the legislation came in, we then said to a tenant, okay, that's fine. If you're suffering hardship, you need to prove it. So they need to give us the information so that we can work out if they are suffering hardship or not. So when we went back to our tenants and said, hey tenants, can you please provide us with this information? We only had 1 out of 10 that actually provided us with information. And that one tenant has now gone through the rent relief process, and we're just waiting for that rent relief grant to be paid. So that's 1 out of 10 out of 250. So we've got a pretty good track record. I know other people, particularly in Blackburn area, into inner city areas, where I know one guy, he's got 450 properties under management, and he's currently got 100 tenancies paying a reduced rent. Now that is massive. That is a quarter of his rent roll on a reduction in rent, which is a massive hit to all of his clients as well as his bottom line as well. But it's got to be due to COVID. So a tenant can't just turn around and say, hey, I can't pay my rent. They've got to be able to prove. So the process of doing it is a tenant will have to work out what income they have from their employer and go through any government financial support and have to work out how long the income will last. Now, obviously, they can go through things like a lot of employers now have got the JobKeeper payments. There's job seeker payments for people as well. There's a lot of government assistance and grants that have come through. They've got to find out if they're eligible for the Vic Government Rent Relief Grant, which is a one-off payment of up to $2,000 paid direct to the landlord. They have to consider any savings they might have, determine what essential expenses they'll be incurring, for example, food, clothing, medical, utilities, phone, internet, education, vehicle, and work out what rent they can afford to pay with their reduced income. So as a guide, paying more than 30% of gross income in these circumstances would be considered rental hardship. In case, I don't know about you, but I use that 30% as a guide when I'm processing applications.
I absolutely have done for years. And you know, it's made it clearer, to be honest. We had an open last week. We went out, we had a lot of people there. It made it very much clearer for us even choosing applications moving forward to be able to actually stand there and say to those tenants, you need to be earning this amount of money to be able to afford this property. Much like you, because of that, I actually spent the first week of the Omnibus Bill coming out and just before that with the rent reductions to be able to write up a whole process from start to finish with the application forms and going through everything that we needed to do. Luckily enough, I've never had to use it. I don't have one tenant in arrears at the moment. All my tenants are paid up because we use that guidelines to start with.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're extremely helpful and supportive to the tenants where we can be. There's lots of places, particularly in Colac, where they can get help if they needed help. And I think if you are a tenant watching this, communication is key with your property manager. It's not time, if you are suffering difficulty, to be able to put your head in the sand. It's time to be able to step up and talk. The more you can talk, the more that you are going to be able to get yourself into a really good position.
Yeah.
You know, and essentially I haven't had one, so I'm a bit shattered that I haven't been able to use my process.
You probably spent a week working on it too. I know what you're like me.
Yeah.
Oh dear. The other thing is there's no predetermined rate or amount that a tenant will be expected to pay. A reduced rate needs to be reasonable to the tenant and the landlord as well. And we've got to remember here too that tenants are suffering, but landlords are too. So it's not just tenants who have lost their jobs, who are, you know, really at a loss here. Owners are really at a loss as well. So we've all got to just work together to get the best outcome for everyone. And I'll be honest, we're suffering. So my rent roll's fine, but my training business has dropped by half. So, you know, for us, we're like all of a sudden going, okay, what do we have to do to keep money coming in? We've had to be really creative about it because we want to be in a situation where we're not going to be, you know, a hindrance to our family members or anything like that. So, you know, you might think that, oh yeah, they'll be fine, but everyone has their own struggles through this.
And I think the other thing that's been missed too, Hayley, is because you're a director, I'm a director, and obviously a friend that's got the 100 that he's working on at the moment. But even as a business, it's not only, like you said, it's not only the landlord and the tenant that miss out. Rent management fees are actually payable on the rent collected. So if your friend in Melbourne's got 100 properties that they're working with CAB to get a reduction on, and most of them go down, you know, 30-40% of their rent, that's 30-40% of the income that comes into his business. So that, I mean, the Prime Minister was right when he said everybody takes a hit.
Yeah.
That's essentially what happens across the board if you have this situation in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what the government's also said is for some tenants, a lesser reduction might be enough to actually keep them paying rent. So they still have a job, but they have reduced hours, for example. For other tenants who rely on government support, a significant reduction might be needed. As a guide, more than 30% of that gross income is considered hardship. So tenants have to put all the information together to present to a landlord. If they have supporting info such as termination letters or Centrelink information, that should be provided as well. If a tenant's not paying rent or has advised the landlord that they're having trouble paying rent due to COVID, the landlord must try to come to an agreement with them about the rent they can afford to pay. Landlords should be clear about what reduction they can also afford for the tenant to pay. So landlords can seek support through insurance, mortgage lender, tax, land tax rebate as well. There's a link here, or rent relief grant as mentioned above. A landlord can ask for supporting information from tenants. So in the very beginning, tenants are like, I'm not giving you any supporting information, but it is actually a requirement. We do need to, and just like a landlord would have to provide supporting information to Consumer Affairs as well.
And as property managers, we use, just so the landlords out there know, it's very similar to when, well, my process that I made is very similar to when your tenant applies for your property.
Yeah.
There's a similar application form that they need to apply for hardship to prove all the things that, similarly to what they prove when they move in, pretty much.
Yeah.
To protect you, so you've got something in writing you can take to your bank, you can take to, you know, your insurer.
Yeah. When you negotiate the rent reduction as well, so once all the information's been given to the landlord, you can put a counter offer back to the tenant, including information about your own financial situation, so the tenant actually understands where you sit and you understand where they sit. The landlord may also be affected by COVID, and you might not be in a position at all to meet the request. But both parties are encouraged to negotiate in good faith, like negotiate with the intention to reach an agreement, try and understand the other party's situation, be flexible, take into account all the info, don't make assumptions about the other party's position either, and actively listen and engage in discussions. So the intention of the government is that the tenant does not end up in a debt situation at the end of this rent reduced period. If a landlord does ask a tenant to defer rather than reduce, and deferring means that, you know, at the end of September, they need to make up that loss. So say you've reduced the rent for the next 6 months by $100 a week. That would mean that in 6 months' time, the tenant owes $2,600, if I've got my maths right, roughly. And that has to be paid back. So a deferment means you get the money eventually, just not now. A reduction is straight reduction. So if an owner talks about a deferment rather than a reduction, they do say to a tenant that they don't have to agree to that request. So when an agreement is reached, all details are registered with CAV. So we've done this with our tenant that's on a reduced rent. And we include, it's actually really easy, you just jump online. Now I was chatting to someone at CAV, they said they've now had 9,000 inquiries come through their website. 9,000.
They're not, are they just all for rent though, or are they the inquiries?
General, just, yeah, they're not all for rent, but just inquiries. I'm like, oh my gosh, as a property manager, if I got 9,000 emails, I'd just walk out the door. But imagine
Yeah, aren't necessarily the quickest people to do things in the first place. So take them the rest of the year to get through those.
Anyway, so you've got to include like name of tenant, name of landlord, property address, rent pre-agreement, and then a rent for the period of the agreement, the time period that the agreement will be in place. So the one that we've actually put in place, we've done it a month at a time because the tenant situation and landlord situation may change in a month. So we've reduced the rent, we've agreed for a month, we'll then reevaluate, meet back with the tenant, have another chat to the landlord, pop it back in for another month. Because she's actually looking for work at the moment. So if she finds something, then we won't have to continue the arrangement. And she's a brilliant long-term tenant. She's been fantastic. And the landlord's been great too. So to register the agreement, you just go to that website. Once it's all registered, you just get information back from them to say it's been registered. At this point in time, you can then apply for that rent relief grant, which is something that we've done to get that $2,000 up to $2,000 payment. Or land tax relief. So interesting with land tax, you can get 25% back on land tax, and they can also defer the future payment as well if you want to. So I own 2 properties in Fitzroy, and I actually had them on Airbnb. So when this all hit, Airbnb no longer available, I had 2 vacant properties. So did another 100 people in Fitzroy that all of a sudden had to try and rent out their properties. So I was actually unable to find tenants. I put them on the rental list. I dropped the rent down 10%, and I've only just rented one, and I'm pretty close to renting the other one now. But what I was able to do was jump onto the land tax website, the State Revenue Office website, pop in the details. I put a copy of the ad and also my authority with my agent. And then they produced that 25% reduction. So it took me all of 5 minutes to put it in for the land tax relief. So even if your property is vacant and you're unable to find a tenant, you can even get that land tax relief as well. So I think that's really helpful. Dispute resolution services are available to reach a rent reduction agreement as well. So if a landlord and tenant just can't agree, you know, say the tenant wants half rent for 6 months and the landlord says, I absolutely can't do that. I can give you $50 deduction for 6 months, but you just can't come to an agreement, then you can go through Consumer Affairs Victoria, and they're going to try and find an outcome that will share the financial burden. So if a landlord does use the services of an agent or a property manager, they should be authorised to act on your behalf. Or if you don't want them to, as a landlord, you can be involved in the process as well. So it's completely up to you what you want to do. If CAV can't reach that agreement, you'll move up a level and it goes through a dispute settlement centre of Victoria. I know one property manager where this is happening on Saturday. So I'm really, really keen to hear the outcome of this one. She's going to let me know on Monday how it works out, but they've got the whole dispute. It's gone up as high as it can go now, this particular one. They can then do binding orders to determine the rent reduction. So if they can't agree after mediation through the whole dispute process, then the residential tenancies will be able to issue a binding order to say what the reduced rent will be. So more information under this. If a tenant wants to leave So if a tenant wants to leave, a tenant can break their lease early or have their fixed term rental period reduced in some circumstances. If a landlord has served a notice to vacate on or after the 29th of March 2020, it's of no effect. So those are null and void. You can still seek a termination notice through the hub, which is the ones I showed you before. A tenant can't be blacklisted if they're unable to pay rent due to COVID, and that's NTD and TICA. So there's some tenancy databases that we use to lodge our tenants and to search tenants when they apply for properties as well. Not everyone uses them, but some people do. Eligible tenants will be available or able to apply for that rent relief grant. So that's an amount of up to $2,000, which is paid direct to the landlord. And it's to compensate the landlord for negotiating and reducing that rent for the tenant. The grant will not be given if the tenant has more than $5,000 in savings and is paying less than 30% of their gross income in rent after the negotiated rent reduction. So I chatted to a property manager the other day and she said, oh, we reduced the rent down to 28%. She said, I didn't work it out. And I said, well, you're not eligible for the rent relief grant. It's got to be still above that 30% mark. Their household income also needs to be below $100,000 as well. If the tenant's not eligible for rent relief grant, they could be eligible for Commonwealth Rent Assistance through Centrelink. Now, I've got quite a few tenants on Centrepay, Centrelink. I don't have any. My Centrepay tenants are brilliant. The rent comes in. I very rarely have an issue. They're absolutely fantastic. So don't be worried about people on benefits. They really are fantastic tenants. And they've got the income coming in regularly. So don't ever think that Centrepay is a bad thing. It absolutely is not. And they're probably...
And those who don't know what Centrepay is, Hayley, it means that essentially if a tenant is on a benefit when you take them on as a tenant, essentially Centrelink pay the agent the rent before the tenant gets their benefit out of their benefit. So basically it means that, you know, we have it set up here. Once again, like Hayley, it's fantastic. You know, we can't make a tenant go on it, but we do advise that it's probably in their best interest too. And essentially, they're some of the best payers that we have.
Correct. Yeah, and I think that's why we've got a lot of tenants on Centrepay, and we really haven't been affected. Whereas in the city areas, not so many tenants on Centrepay, and they're losing jobs. They don't have the income coming through. So the new laws are obviously in effect for 6 months as well. You can't increase landlords' tenants' rent at all during this time. So say in January, Casey served a rent increase on a tenant, and that rent increase was going to take effect in mid-April. It's void. You can't increase the rent. You also can't serve a notice of rent increase for the next 6 months. So if you do want to increase the rent, it has to be after the COVID legislation, so starting at the end of September. You can obviously get that 25% reduction for land tax. The relief is also available to landlords who are unable to secure that tenant, and you can defer the payment as well for land tax. Relief is available for resi and commercial. So I'm not a commercial expert. Casey knows more about commercial than I do. So ask her those ones.
It's a whole different kettle of fish. There's a whole code of conduct that is
huge, isn't it?
Much bigger than the legislation that's coming from on COVID with the Omnibus Bill. The stuff that's out there for commercial at the moment is technical. It's written very technically, and it has lots and lots and lots of things in it. However, it does give a very clear guideline to where a landlord and a tenant need to negotiate to.
Yep.
You know, and there is ways around things that are there, and obviously I've got one that we were looking at possibly, and I think they could be watching. My lovely little tenants that I've got, they are in a commercial situation. The landlord wasn't entitled to any land tax rebates. So we came up with a better option for both of them that was more than what the reduction would have been in the first place. Yeah. And the commercial guidelines that were there helped us with that.
Awesome.
But if you are a commercial landlord and you're watching, get your agent to be able to make sure that they're giving you a copy of that, because otherwise it will just sound like double Dutch if someone speaks in a language that you're not necessarily understanding. But yeah, with the when you said about the rent increases, just to confirm, Hayley, that doesn't mean you're sending your 60 days worth of your rent increase notice. They have to be sent after the on the 1st of October to be eligible for December. So it's not like we can send them in, you know, July, ready for September. They have to be sent, you know, 1st of October forward, or 30th September, forward.
That's it.
Was there also, just another question, Hayley, sorry. Was there is there an amount of time that you found with your land tax issues with your properties sitting vacant, that they needed to be vacant for before you were eligible?
No, it just said that you were having trouble. You currently had the property on the market for rent and you were unable to find a tenant due to COVID.
Yeah, so those landlords that are out there at the moment that have had vacant properties for a week or two, this would be something that they would really need to probably look at doing.
Yeah, I can't remember if I had to put the dates in. Mine were both vacant at the time though. I think I might have had to put the date that I first advertised the property for lease. But I don't know if that comes into it or not. It just, because I haven't got any confirmation back yet. I'm just expecting that when I get my land tax, it's 25% cheaper. I think.
Well, everyone would like that. So,
but look, I've got another apartment in South Yarra and that property's rented. So the tenants actually had given notice to vacate. And when COVID hit, they were moving overseas and they rang me, or they rang my agent and they said, can we stay because we can't go overseas anymore? And I had a rent increase due to take effect from May. And I said, absolutely, they can stay, remove a rent increase and just tell them they're fine. They can just give me another 28 days when they want to go. We've removed a rent increase and just stay. And that was fantastic for me because I've got a tenant staying and they didn't have to go and try and find something either. So I didn't go for any, obviously, land tax relief on that because I'm not making a loss. There's no difference for me. But my two that became vacant, that was, a little bit concerning when they both came up at the same time. So commercial as well, and we've got to understand commercials had the biggest hit out of everything, and particularly, you know, cafes and shops and my beauticians, hairdressers. My beautician, my nail beauty technician's been closed for nearly 2 months now. My hairdresser's only just opened. So when this happens, they have no income coming through apart from the government support. So they will need some form of rent relief to help them through. Eligible tenants, landlords just apply for that land tax through my tax website. It's actually really easy to use. You just register and just jump on and it will step you through the process. So what about landlords and tenants? Obviously the new laws do support landlords and help protect tenants from eviction, other than in exceptional circumstances, and they allow for rent to be reduced if they're suffering hardship. If you have served a notice to vacate for a tenant who can't pay their rent because of hardship from coronavirus, it is of no effect as well. So if your tenant refuses to pay rent, so in the very beginning, there was this group called Rent Strike. And you saw that on Facebook, Kate? Yeah, so and it was on, I think they got on A Current Affair, didn't they, or Today Tonight? I can't remember.
Until they booted me out, I must have been found out that I was a property manager and got booted out. So.
I'm still in there. But yeah, basically this group of people just said, we're going to send letters to agencies and say, we're not paying rent. That's it. So that is something that they've actually put in the legislation, that if a tenant decides not to pay rent, but they can pay rent, then that is a breach and you can evict them for non-payment of rent. But if a tenant is affected by coronavirus, meaning they've lost their jobs, you know, something like that's happened, then you can't evict them. And I think that's completely fair, because if you're just saying, I'm not going to communicate and pay rent, then we should have something we can do to come to a resolution or remove them from the property. So I'm glad that came through. Because I think in the beginning, people just thought, I'll stop paying rent, no one can evict me. It's not the case. A tenant can break their lease early or have their fixed term agreement reduced as well. So you can't increase the rent up until the end of September. So say 1st of October, Casey can send out a rent increase. It's got to be to a reasonable amount. So if a market in your area has dropped 10% due to COVID, then you're not going to obviously be able to increase that rent. You can only increase it to market rate. Government would prefer you come to an agreement for reduced rent rather than that deferral. They don't want people to end up in that debt situation. And you and your tenant's personal circumstances may change over the next few months, so you can reflect this in an agreement by putting in a review date or a trigger such as a change of employment or income status. So it's just a matter of all parties communicating. If you need to chat, just pick up the phone and talk to your property manager, because they want to help. It's part of what we do. And we can only help if we know what's going on. If we don't know what's going on, unfortunately, we're not mind readers. It'd be awesome if we were. So ending a tenancy. So if a notice to vacate was issued prior to 29th of March and seeks to evict a tenant after you state it's not effective. So you can't evict your tenants unless VCAT's determined it's reasonable to do so. A tenant on a periodic tenancy can end their agreement by giving 28 days notice to vacate as normal. So when the legislation first came out, there was this little loophole in it that tenants couldn't give a notice to vacate unless it was for any of these reasons below. So a whole lot of property managers just said to tenants, you can't move out. It's not the case. They have actually reversed that. It was just an unintended consequence of the way the legislation was written, but it put everyone in a bit of a spin. But yes, tenants can still give 28 days notice.
You could see in reading it in the first place about why they put it in there, though. It was kind of like, okay, Mr. Landlord, if you give these guys a rent reduction, we'll make sure that they stay in so they can pay the amount that you had reduced, so that you're not taking a hit on your rent for a month or 2 months and then just having them move out.
That's right.
And having the property sit vacant. So you can see kind of why it was there, but it made more issues than good.
Yeah.
Because it was actually keeping tenants that had already said,
Correct.
I've got a house, I'm moving into it next month. And the legislation was written that I'm sorry, you need to stay there until the 29th of September, and I'm sorry you can't move into your new house.
I know, it was crazy, and a lot of property managers were telling tenants they couldn't go, so it was a bit of a mess.
Which made it it did make it very difficult for rental reference checking too, because you'd be calling for a rental reference and they can't move, so what are you calling for?
I know.
And then it was very quickly reversed. Thank you.
Yeah, it was, thank God.
Yep.
So a tenant can end their fixed term tenancy by providing notice of intention to vacate, giving 14 days. And if they did this, they wouldn't be paying any break lease fees either. So just be aware of that. They can break their lease at no penalty. If they require special or personal care, if they get into public or community housing, if they get into temporary crisis accommodation or specialist disability accommodation, if they're suffering severe hardship, or if you have applied to vacate to terminate a tenancy, they can give you 14 days return notice. They don't need to apply to VCAT to end a tenancy in these circumstances, and there would be no break lease fees. Now, if a tenant decides to break their lease just because they want to break their lease, then of course break lease fees still apply. But if they're part of any of these COVID or severe hardship, then you do have to let them just go. And you're better off letting them go and then getting a tenant that can afford to pay the rent than keeping them there and having a tenant that can't afford to pay the rent, I believe.
And those landlords out there, Hayley, who aren't, because there's actually not a lot of break leases down here, surprisingly.
Yeah,
but
it's not a country thing.
All mine, in Colac, they kind of sit in and they stay. They don't move. So you get very comfortable in your rental property if you're a tenant.
Yep.
Essentially, to those guys, what break lease fees are is where an agent would usually charge you a letting fee to be able to manage to find a new tenant for your property. If your tenant is in a lease and they decide to move out before the end of their lease, those fees are still payable, but they're payable in a portion by the tenant to the agent instead of the landlord, so that you're not forking out another heap of fees because it wasn't your fault that you broke the lease, the tenant did. So that's what Hayley's saying, is that there's no break lease fees if it's one of those 5 or 6 reasons why they had to move, which essentially they're in a position where they wouldn't be able to pay them anyway. They don't want to leave because they can't, they have to. It's because they have to, it's not because they want to. Whereas, I've got one at the moment that's come up. There's a tenant who has just bought a house. She wasn't expecting to buy a house, but she's bought one. It means she has to move out her other one. But break lease fees are still payable on that property, which means that landlord's not out of pocket because she's not in hardship. She's not in anything else. She's had a change of circumstances.
Yeah.
Which happens.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yeah.
But that's probably a little bit of an understanding of the thing that doesn't happen in our
yeah.
Yeah.
It happens so often in the city, so I'm like, everyone knows about break leases.
When I was in Melbourne, if you had 20 break leases in a month, it was a good month.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's very different. I tell you what, country's so much nicer to manage, having done both. With termination applications, VCAT has to consider whether it's reasonable and proportionate. They really don't want to kick out anyone. They want to keep people safe, secure in their homes. So really, eviction is the last resort, and we're seeing that across the legislation as well. So it means that we shouldn't assume that a tenant will be required to leave. Sometimes VCAT will order that tenancy will end. Then they'll give it a minimum amount of time that tenant must be given to leave after the VCAT decision. So they are extending periods of time for people. And the other thing is there's not necessarily that many properties on the market for tenants to look for, because more tenants are sitting tight. They're not moving out. So selection for tenants, we've got one property on the internet at the moment, Casey. And I think next week we've got about another 5 coming on, which is awesome. But we don't have a lot of stock at the moment because our tenants aren't moving. They're staying where they are. So it's a very different one.
I had one come out in Cressy, and I don't know if you know where Cressy is, but it's way
yeah.
And I had 20 groups turn up to the first open back on Friday, and it was leased in Monday morning.
Yeah, we're having no problems moving our stock at the moment. They're just like, gone, done. VCAT could order an immediate termination if it finds that the tenant's caused serious damage, the tenant's endangering safety, the tenant has been given a notice to leave under Section 368, so serious acts of violence, or the property's unfit for human habitation. We're actually going through a possession application at the moment for a tenant who is endangering the safety of neighbours. He has also caused serious damage to the property. So we've got both running at the moment. Sorry, my cat just walked up the stairs. I didn't know what that was behind me. And we're still waiting. It's been 3 weeks and we're still waiting for that. So although they say it'll be immediate termination, we're actually still waiting to get it through VCAT.
It's also interesting to note, Hayley, that obviously Hayley and I have done a lot of research on the new rules that are coming in, or that they've now been delayed, but they were due in on the 1st of July and they're now delayed back to sometime before the 1st of January. It will come in. We don't know yet, but we're all still working towards those changes of laws that are there. Part of it was that the safety of your agent, the contractors and your employees wasn't in the current legislation.
Correct.
So they've snuck that into the omnibus legislation prior to actually coming in at the new legislation, again, that comes in January.
Yeah.
So it will affect all of this. So it's, it's protective. Hayley will tell you, I will tell you, over my career, there's been several different circumstances where it's been dangerous as an agent or even as a contractor. I've had a contractor punched in the nose once by a tenant, plumber of mine. I had to go and buy him a nice big slab of beer. Yeah. But, there is danger for different circumstances. You never know as an agent or even as a landlord, if you're a private landlord, what you're going to walk into at someone's house. Like it is something that's there. So it's interesting to see. It was actually a nice thing as a property manager to be able to see that included in the omnibus bill before the new ones come in.
That's right. They actually snuck about 8 things in, which are in the new legislation that have come in the COVID legislation. So there's about 8 changes which have come in early, which is great. And they're all the good ones, the ones that we're actually pushing for. So I'm happy with that. So a tenant would have to give, or VCAT would have to give a tenant at least 14 days notice to leave if they find that tenants made serious threats or intimidation against you, the owner, the agent, contractors or employees. So that's something that was coming in the new legislation that they've snuck in early. If a tenant has failed to comply with a VCAT order or if it's assigned or sublet without consent. VCAT would give the tenant at least 28 days notice to leave if they failed to comply with their obligations under a tenancy agreement, including not paying rent in circumstances where they could have done so without suffering that severe hardship. So that's a 28-day notice. And the tenant has not complied with a VCAT order such as having a pet, and they're not allowed to have a pet because you've got an order saying they can't. It would be 60 days to leave if you're selling the property, if you or a family member or an owner is moving in.
Before you go any further, I know that there are a couple of conveyancers that have asked some questions recently about properties for sale that have got a tenant in it at the moment.
Yep.
Usually, obviously, contract would go unconditional. We'd be asked to be able to serve a notice to vacate to the tenant for 60 days. Settlement would then probably be about 15 days later by the time you got through everything.
Yeah.
So essentially a 90-day contract on the sale. In your experience, because I know I haven't had any yet, but have you heard from any other property managers about, getting your unconditional contract in place, and then the length of time from going to CAV to lodge it and then getting to VCAT and then getting your date? Have you heard from anybody about how that's affecting settlements, the new legislation?
Not yet. I know a lot of people have gone to CAV, they've got the code, they've done it, but nothing's come through yet. They don't have confirmation. And this is a problem. Like, we've got the process, but until we actually follow the complete process, we're not going to know how long it takes. And some people have said, oh, I've already got the rent relief and I put in for it on this date. And people are like, well, I put in for it 2 weeks before that date and I don't have it yet. So it doesn't seem to be like the next in line gets seen first. It's kind of like do you agree? It's kind of a bit of a mess, and people are like, but I did that before you and I'm still waiting, and now they're chasing, and it's very great.
So we obviously do sales in here as well. Predominantly a property manager. We do sales as well. So would you be saying, I've been thinking about this actually a lot, because there's a couple of our properties that'll come up possibly with tenants. That the average settlement period will now go from kind of that 70-day mark until we know a little more, probably out to more the 120-day mark, and to be bought back by agreement if you can get possession earlier. Considering
I wouldn't want it less than 90 days. It's got to, I reckon 120 days is probably your safe bet. At the moment, 90 days you might squeeze it in, but or if you can, put off till after the September if you're not urgent to sell. Mind you, the market's not bad at the moment to sell in areas. So
we've got nothing left to sell. They're all gone off market. They were gone before they were even advertised. So
so I think 120 day to be safe. I think that's a good idea. And obviously last week we got told that we can start doing opens, which was like the most super exciting news that we've had in ages. Ali's on here and she said she's got one of those at the moment. She'll keep us updated. So that'll be interesting to see how she goes with the wholesale thing on that one, getting notice to vacate.
Let's hope travel restrictions are over by then and we can all catch up for a wine and...
I'm up for that. So open for inspections, everyone has to keep at least 1.5 metres from each other and practice safe hygiene practices. Obviously, we all know what they are now, regular hand washing and sanitising. With auctions, no more than 10 people to attend, excluding the owners and residents of the property, and anyone else reasonably required to facilitate the auction as well. The agent doesn't permit their density quota of people in the space to be exceeded. So you've just got to be really careful about the size of the property. And on the website, it actually gives you ideas about how big the property is, so how many people can actually be in there. For lease, the agent doesn't allow more than 10 people to enter the premises at any one time, excluding the owner resident of the property and anyone reasonably required to facilitate the inspection. The agent doesn't permit the density quota of people in the space to be exceeded as well. The agent
too, Hayley. Like I said, we had our first open last week. It was really great. The tenants that were there were understanding of the process that they have to go through to be able to look through a property. And because you can't have, it was quite a small property because you can't have so many people in there at once, it was good to stand your 1.5 metres and you actually got a lot more information from your tenant than just people. So the tenants that are actually looking for properties out there at the moment are really good with this. They do want to get in and have a look at the properties, but they're very understanding that the process can take a tiny bit longer than the normal 15 minutes where you sardine squish everybody in and sardine squish everybody out. But it's actually beneficial to landlord, tenant and agent to have that little bit of spacing, that little bit of time. To learn a bit more.
So you have to obviously ask the name and contact information of everyone. We do that anyway. Every agent does that. but you have to keep a record of those details of the date and time at which the person attended, because if something does go wrong and they have to track it back, then you need to be able to provide that information. And people with coronavirus symptoms can obviously attend remotely. And that coronavirus app that we've got, that COVID app, it's encouraged that you ask tenants to download it, but you can't say it's a condition of entry. So obviously that COVID app is great if you have it, because if something does happen, you can get notified and they can track it back. But it's absolutely can't be a condition of entry because it is voluntary.
They're really abiding by it too, because I mean, essentially the way I put it to them was, look, it's to protect my safety as well as theirs.
Yeah, exactly.
I would prefer to be able to make sure that if this is open to generally strangers, they're not normally booked appointments. So group of strangers gathering together, it makes sense that, it isn't a requirement, but it's definitely a smart move.
Yep, absolutely. Now, did anyone have any questions? Because Casey and I are happy to answer them. We've finished the, formal fun part, but happy to answer any questions if you have any. Or did you have anything else you wanted to add, Case?
I actually had one more thing that I know that you're a guru on, that I think most people here listening would probably, is probably going to be the biggest change for our community coming into the new legislation, the stuff that's coming in January, the next lot that we can be able to help you all through. Minimum standards in rental properties is really going to be something that I think is going to hit our community quite hard.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of older properties, and essentially we have a lot of long-term landlords and a lot of long-term tenants in a lot of houses. These landlords have owned their property for 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, longer. And although they've had a longer term tenant in there, being that tenant's either on a periodic lease now, or that lease is about to roll over just after January, and essentially getting them out a bit of information that, it doesn't matter how long your tenant's been in there, the minute that lease is up, you have to meet the new legislation.
Correct.
So I think getting a little bit of information out there about what, as I know I've been working on it. I know you've been working on it. I know that I've been going through my rental properties and going, okay, well, there's a gas heater that's there that's been disconnected, that we've got a split system above it, and we need to. The new legislation says if it's there, it's got to be worked. So we can't just leave it. So we need to start working towards those things. Locks on doors is going to be another big one down here. We only have one lock in town. He's about to report. Those kind of things. So just getting your step through, because I know that you have coned minimum standards.
There's a couple of really tricky ones, and these are in the regulations at the moment, so they're actually in draft form. So what I'm going to say to you is correct in draft form. We were expecting to have the full regulations out by mid-May but it hasn't come out because of COVID, so I expect it'll probably come out, in a couple of months' time. But a couple of the tricky ones there is obviously around that heating. So basically every apartment has to have a working fixed heater in the living area, and every house will have to have a heater. Now, in the beginning, you can just put like a wall panel heater into your houses, but within 3 years, they're going to have to be upgraded to a higher level compliance, meaning that you'd either have to put in a gas heater, a ducted system, or ducted or hydronic system with the vent in the living area, a split system, or a wood heater, combustion heater. So they're your options. So for the first 3 years, you can get away with having just a wall panel heater, but by 2023, you will have to put in a high level of heating. One of the other ones that I thought was absolutely ridiculous, so I might as well tell you, or two actually, I'll tell you what they are. One of them is every window in the property that is capable of being opened or closed has to be able to be opened or closed in an open or closed position. So that means, often we have an older style house, you've got those beautiful double hung windows. One of them will open in the bedroom, but the other one won't. So we've always gone, it's fine because one opens. Well, it actually states in the regulations that every window has to work. So don't love that one. The other one I don't love is if your property has laundry facilities, it has to have adequate hot and cold water. So a lot of those older style properties might only have a cold water attachment in the laundry. You will have to upgrade that so it has hot water, or pull the laundry out if the property goes vacant. So you just don't provide a property with a laundry. I would suggest putting in hot water, but that could be quite expensive for people as well. I think there's about 12 or 13 of them that come into play, but they're probably my main concerns. Oh, and obviously
property deadlocks. So
yeah, deadlocks. Yeah.
If your property has the normal handle door with the key lock in it, you're actually going to need to have a deadlock as well installed to each external door, except, correct me if I'm wrong, if there's a security door that's lockable in front of it.
Yeah. And a deadlock means a dead latch with at least one cylinder. Now, I'm not a locksmith, so I'm going to wait until I get this set in concrete, then find out exactly what that is. But yeah, their definition's a dead latch with at least one cylinder. Who knows?
Yeah. The other thing that I suppose that I can see with the new legislation coming in is, I'm not sure how many of you have bought and sold property, but when you buy and sell property, there's section 32 that you obviously look over before you buy it. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's going to be disclosure statements on rental properties that will need to be advertised, much like if you buy a property and you see a statement of information on a residential property, it'll be up. Well, I'm thinking that's how mine will go up. Mine will go up like a statement of information on the advertising. It'll mean that you'll have to, let your tenant know about things like asbestos, those kind of things that are around your property. And I haven't seen, have you seen anything anywhere about what it's going to look like, Hayley, like your disclosure?
No, but there's stuff coming into the property has been a known, subject to a known homicide in the last 5 years. If the property has been used for the manufacture, storage or use of drugs, like methamphetamine, for the last 5 years. There's a whole lot of stuff actually coming. In New South Wales, they've brought that in. I don't think they have to advertise it with the properties, but they have to provide it to a tenant prior to signing the lease. And the landlord has to fill that out and sign off on it every time they lease the property, even if you do a lease renewal. So before we lease the property, we'll have to say, fill this out, get it back to us, and now we can lease your property. So yeah, we're not exactly sure what's going to have to be required with that one, but there'll be, I think it'll be almost like commercial where they do disclosure statements for commercial potentially. I am
hoping that the system that we use as agents that brings out where our forms are, that they will have something very similar to that on there that you can just fill out as part of a tenancy. Because if we all have to make our own, God knows what they're going to look like between all the different agents. But essentially, it's going to, my understanding is it's going to become like the little red book that as a tenant we give out to the tenants. There's a little guide that comes from Consumer Affairs that we give out to them. As a landlord, as a tenant, if you don't give your disclosure statement to your tenant or your essential disclosure of description or whatever they come out with that we actually have to put it on to your tenant, it's going to be much like your little red book. You can get in trouble for not, as an agent, as a landlord, for not giving that to your tenant 7 days, I think it's 7 days prior to the release signed. I think that's one of the only other ones that the minimum standards will be very, very big here. I'm very aware, and look, as we've got some great tradies around town that can help out. Whether I've been looking at going and talking to locksmiths to see what type of deals they can get for the ones that are coming to be able to change those over. But essentially, it'll take a little bit of work. To be able to get through them, and they're not expecting you to do it straight away.
No.
If you have a current lease, that's why it's probably important right now, if you don't have your tenant on a lease, to get your tenant on a lease. Because it's going to
buy yourself more time. Agreed.
If you were to sign a lease with your tenant now, or as a tenant you were to sign a lease, you go for an 18-month lease. It means that you don't have to meet any of those changes, and for 18 months from now, you've got time to be able to do things. But if your lease is going to run short, if your lease expires on the 3rd of January, your property has to be up to scratch on the 3rd of January. Because we know that the rules are coming in 1st of Jan.
They are staggering, some of them though. So for example, window furnishings won't come in till 2021. Electrical compliance is 2022. So you don't have to do, not compliance, but upgrades. You won't have to do it till 2022. The main heating upgrade is 2023. So they have staggered some of those more expensive ones, which is awesome. But a lot of the little ones won't be, you know, so expensive than they are in smack bang on the dot.
Yeah. So we can expect our landlords to have a really good couple of tax years over the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
Love it.
It's a lot of information to go over, guys. So if you've got any questions, just let us know.
Otherwise, you're welcome to just shoot Casey an email or call her tomorrow. I'm sure she'd love to chat to everyone.
So I'm a bit of a chatter. And look, I can, if you needed it, just feel free to email. I can send out a copy of what's been written in the background with Hayley and I, out to everybody to have on their files to make sure that they, you know, they can re-watch this webinar if something came up and they had something that they went, oh, I saw that in a webinar, and you can go back and have a look at what Hayley and I have had a bit of a chat about today.
Yeah, just remember it is up to date as of now. Tomorrow it might not be. So with all the changes coming through, just make sure that if you are relying on any information that you're just double checking that it is still current as of now, because just the goalposts are shifting so quickly for us. So
yeah, and you know what, your property manager will probably, well, I know Hayley is, and you know, it's something that to do our job correctly, we watch the news, we watch Consumer Affairs website, we scour VCAT's website, we get everything from the REIB, and we probably overanalyze everything that comes into us. But that's part of our job. It's part of what we have to do, and it's part of how we protect our landlords and tenants to make sure that they're all working in the same way. And that's probably why you have one rent decrease and I have none.
Well, I spent 2 hours online yesterday just looking for new information, because I need to know. I need to know what's going on so I can educate everyone else and make sure that my business is running properly as well. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for having me, Casey. Well done.
That's okay. Thank you to everybody coming along, and thank you, Hayley. You are a whiz at this sort of stuff. So glad to have you on board.
I'm going to go and put my children to bed, and they have been very quiet, so I don't know what the husband's done to entertain them for the last hour. But
I was actually watching going, I had to come to the office to get away from kids. Like, my kids were noisy as noisy, and they, you know, I was like, thank God, Kenny, cook them tea and please get them in the bath, and I'll see you in bed.
Yeah, mine are obviously watching Netflix or something down the other end of the house, so my husband's done very well tonight. I love it. But thanks, Case. I really appreciate it, and I'll send you a copy of the recording shortly.
That'd be wonderful. Has everyone gone?
No, not yet.
Nah, beauty. All right. Thank you very much for coming along, guys.
No problem. All right. Okay, I've stopped sharing.
Is that just us now?
I'll end it and then I'll call you.